I'm going to speak to you this morning about the topic of Upon This Rock. Some years ago, it's getting close to 20 years ago now, you know, as a preacher, people are always giving you books to read, and everybody's got a book that you just have to read this book. I got a stack of them at home, and little by little I get through them. One of our members actually gave me two joke books about 2 years ago, and you just have to read these joke books, and he kept asking me about it and pestering me. Finally, I gave them back to him and said, I don't want to hear about these joke books anymore. But this book somebody gave to me almost 20 years ago, and I've forgotten the title and I've forgotten the author. But it was one of those books that you knew pretty early on you were going to disagree with an awful lot that was in that book, because this book denied all sorts of things like the virgin birth and the resurrection and all the miracles of Jesus. And so they basically presented Jesus as someone who didn't have any abilities to do anything miraculous whatsoever, and someone whose life was completely unremarkable in terms of anything miraculous or anything that we might call divine. And the authors went on to say, however, that this was not any kind of an attack on Christianity like you might think that it would be. And here's why they said that. They said the core of Christianity is in what Jesus taught, not who he was. I'm here to debunk that thinking today. They said this, and this is a quote. I did write down the quote, even though I didn't write down the name. Any thoughtful Christian would concur that Jesus' primary significance resides in the message he sought to communicate. And they go on to say that his teachings are valid in and of themselves, regardless of who it was that taught him. And then they come to this conclusion that the teachings of Jesus need nothing miraculous to support them. And they maintain that if the teachings of Jesus need something miraculous to support them, if they require miracles, then it suggests one of two things in their thinking. And they think the second one is more likely. The first one is that there's something seriously defective in his teachings. So if there have to be miracles in order for us to accept the teachings of Jesus, either there's something seriously defective in his teachings, or secondly, there's something seriously defective in the faith of the believer. Of course, these statements and this whole concept, this whole idea, is based on some assumptions on their part. And there's two main assumptions I want to explore here for just a little bit by way of introduction. And the first one is that man is capable of recognizing divine truth when they encounter it. That's an assumption that they make, that when mankind comes face to face with divine truth, they will automatically recognize it and know it for what it is. They don't need any kind of verification that it is in fact divine truth. And the second assumption, I think, that we need to talk about a little bit is that man is capable of verifying or invalidating the spiritual claims of Jesus. Now, that's a pretty major problem. Those are pretty major problems for their idea, because neither one of those assumptions is true. After all, how do we know for certain? You remember back when the Heaven's Gate cult said that they were going to hitch a ride on a spacecraft that was hidden in the tail of that comet? How do we know that that's not where they are right now? Now, I have no illusions that that is where they are. I don't believe for a second that that's true. But how do I disprove that claim? I really don't have any way to disprove that claim. People can make all kinds of ridiculous claims, but if they make them about things that you have no way to verify, then they're pretty safe in making those claims, however ridiculous that they might be. We could list all kinds of counterexamples to these assumptions that these guys make. But a couple of scriptures ought to be sufficient to disprove these two assumptions. First of all, I want to point out that the serpent made some spiritual claims to Eve. You remember that? God, I'm going to paraphrase here. God doesn't want you to have your eyes open and be a God like him. And therefore, he's forbidden you to eat of this fruit. And he also said that when you eat of it, you won't die. And so he made some spiritual claims there, but I want you to notice that Eve did not recognize his lies for what they were. She was deceived. That's what the Bible says. She was deceived. But maybe the ultimate proof that man is not capable of recognizing divine truth when they encounter it, and that we have no way of verifying or invalidating the spiritual claims of Jesus, is that mankind took the Word of God, made flesh, and hung him on a cross. And in fact, I might just point out one thing in particular, and that is that when Jesus goes before Pilate, and Pilate, at some point, and the way I picture it is that Pilate just became exasperated, and he just threw up his hands and says, "What is truth?" Well, here's truth incarnate right in front of him, and he doesn't recognize it for what it is. Jesus made all kinds of spiritual claims that we don't have any way to verify or invalidate. And I could give you lots of those, and you could think of a lot of them, but just stop and think about what Jesus said about hell. Do you have any way to verify that? Not while you're living. Hopefully not after you're dead, right? I don't have any way to verify whether that's true or disprove it from being true. I don't have any way to do either one of those things. And Jesus said all kinds of things that were just based on his authority as God in the flesh. So these assumptions they're really based on this idea, and I don't want to spend much time on this, but this idea that the mind of man, let's say it right, is the final court of appeals for any and all truth. In other words, we as human beings, we are capable of discerning truth, and we have that innate ability. And so if you can convince me of something, then it must be right. And if you can't convince me of it, then it must be wrong. And so the mind of man is just the final court of appeals. That's the way some people approach truth. There are still people out there, I don't know if you realize this or not, who don't accept the idea that the world is round as opposed to being flat. If the mind of man is the final court of appeals, why do we not agree universally about spiritual matters or even matters about the world around us? Obviously, that's a flawed way of thinking. The reality is that many of the most important claims and teachings of Jesus we have to accept on faith. And let me tell you what I mean by that. We have to trust that he knows what he's talking about and that he's telling us the truth. After all, that's what faith really is. If you read Hebrews chapter 11, faith boils down to you believe what God says because of who he is, you judge him to be trustworthy, and therefore you believe what he says even though you haven't seen it yourself and you have no way to verify it through any sort of sensory means. We believe the teachings of Jesus because it was Jesus who taught them. We don't accept his person because of his teachings. We accept his teachings because of his person. See, who says something often makes all the difference in the world as to whether or not we accept it as true. All you have to do, and you can come up with 100 examples of this over the next week, I promise you. You just have to listen to what one side of the aisle says in politics, and then listen to what the other side of the aisle says in politics, and then go back and listen to what these people said 6, 8, 10 years ago, and you realize that there's a lot of times that people care a whole lot more about who said something than the truthfulness of what it is they said. But when it comes to Jesus, the reason I accept so many of his teachings is because it was Jesus who is demonstrably God in the flesh who said it. And when we're talking about divine claims, and we don't have any way to either verify those claims or discredit those claims, we have to decide, do we trust the one who made those claims? And that's Jesus. Ultimately, it is the resurrection of Christ that demonstrates both the truth of his claims of divinity and his person. It is his resurrection that makes his person manifest. And so God says it like this through the pen of Paul in Romans chapter 1, beginning in verse 3. He says, concerning the Son Jesus Christ our Lord, who was born of the seed of David according to the flesh, and declared to be the Son of God with power, according to the Spirit of holiness, by the resurrection from the dead. See, the resurrection from the dead was a way that God declared him to be the Son of God with power. according to the Spirit of holiness. Peter's sermon on the day of Pentecost was all about the resurrection and how the resurrection proved that Jesus was both Lord and Christ. Paul says that the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ were of first importance in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And he goes on to say that our faith is empty and it's useless, and that our preaching even is empty if in fact Jesus did not rise from the dead. You see, you cannot take the position that the miracles of Christ, and specifically the resurrection, are just inconsequential to what it is that Jesus taught. The resurrection verified the person of Jesus as well as the power of Jesus, and it's only because of this that we can accept his teachings as divine, rather than merely good philosophy or even good morality. Let me just say this before I forget to say it. What I think is one of the most convincing reasons not to be a Muslim is that millions of Muslims every year go and visit the tomb of Muhammad. But the tomb of Jesus Christ is empty. It matters. It matters not just what somebody taught, but who they were. Now, the person of Jesus is shown to be vitally important to our faith in him and his teachings in the text that we have in front of us in Matthew as well. This is clearly the main emphasis of this passage. In Matthew chapter 16, and beginning in verse 13, here's what we read. When Jesus came into the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, saying, "Who do men say that I, the Son of Man, am?" And so they said, "Some say John the Baptist, some Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." And he said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered and said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Jesus answered and said to him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I also say to you that you are Peter, on this rock I'll build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. And I'll give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." And then he commanded his disciples that they should tell no one that he was Jesus the Christ. Now, Jesus is asking two questions in this text. They are the most important questions that you will ever consider. Who do men say he is? And who do you say that he is? The first one, of course, is important in general, but the second one is what really matters to you personally when it comes to your eternal destination. What the world says about Jesus is not nearly as important to your salvation as what you believe about him. But I want to just kind of combine these two questions for a moment into this one question: who is Jesus? That's really the question that's being asked here. Who is Jesus? And I want you to notice the world has several answers that all disagree and all fall short. But then there's the God-given answer. There's a divine answer to this. But the answer to the question of who Jesus is going to determine what you believe about Jesus and his teachings. The answer to this question will determine what religions you might accept and which ones you'll reject. The answer to this question is what divides the religious world. It doesn't take too much reflection to realize that. The answer to this question is what determines your eternal destination. Now, I just want to take one moment and notice, before we move on here, where this question was asked. This question was asked at Caesarea Philippi, which was a very pagan place, and it was in fact named after a pagan god. It had been named Peneus after the Greek god Pan initially. Later it was named for Caesar Augustus. But I think that Jesus asked these questions in that place and not the temple or someplace like that for a reason. And I just want to make this point in passing. It's not what you say about Jesus when you're at the holy place, surrounded by believers, that really matters. It's what you say about him in the pagan and unbelieving world that counts. It's pretty easy to stand up in a crowd like this and espouse and teach about the divinity of Jesus, but do it out there. Do it out there in the world around us. Just like there's two different questions, there's really two different answers given in this text. The one is man's answer, and the other is really God's answer, even though it's given by the mouth of Peter. It's God's answer to this question. And so I want to look at both of these, and then I want to consider how we know that God's answer is the correct one. Man's answer. Well, the world around the apostles, they gave all kinds of potential answers to this question of who Jesus is. They gave several to choose from, and a lot of people like to do that nowadays. They don't want to be held down to any one belief, and so they'll say things like, well, you know, I saw a television program years ago where these two ladies were meeting, and the one lady says, well, are you religious? And she says, well, I think there is some kind of higher power, but that higher power could be almost anything. It could be the Christ of the Bible. It could be Buddha. It could be, and she listed a whole bunch, and the other lady looked at her and said, so in other words, you don't believe anything. That was pretty perceptive, because if you're willing to believe anything, then you really believe nothing. And that's the way the world likes to do it. Don't pin me down to anything specific. It could be this, it could be that, it could be something else. But there's something there. We just don't know for sure what that might be. Well, some said that Jesus was John the Baptist. Now, that might seem like a pretty high estimation of him. After all, Jesus himself said that John the Baptist was the greatest prophet ever born of woman. He was the forerunner of Messiah. He came in the spirit of Elijah. But even John the Baptist admitted that Jesus was much greater than himself. He said, Jesus is greater than me, and he was before me. He said, I'm not even worthy to loose his sandal strap. And he called him the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world. And he called him the Son of God. And when Jesus, you remember, came to be baptized of John, John said, I have need to be baptized of you. John was a great prophet, no question about that. But can I say this without you thinking I'm saying blasphemy? He was really nothing compared to Jesus. John never performed any miracles. Herod cut his head off for rebuking him of sin, and he died. But here's the important part. What sets him apart from Jesus is he didn't rise from the dead. Now, I think he will, of course, in the last day. But he didn't rise from the dead like Jesus did. Well, others said Jesus, well, maybe he's Elijah. Elijah, again, was a great prophet of God. And remember, he took on all those prophets on Mount Baal, or all the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. Let me get my facts straight here. Remember how they prayed all morning? And they jumped around and they cut themselves until the blood was gushing out of them, trying to get the attention of their God. Aren't you glad we don't have to do that to get the attention of our God? And nothing happened. But Elijah, he said, this is too easy for God. I want you to dig a trench around the altar. I want you to pour water over it and keep doing that until the trench is full of water. And he prayed one short prayer. And fire from heaven consumed the sacrifice and the wood and the stones and the dust and all the water in the trench. And you remember Elijah was taken away in that fiery chariot in the whirlwind. And we see him with Moses and Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration. So no doubt about it, Elijah was a great prophet. But even Elijah was nothing compared to Jesus. God himself rebuked Peter for suggesting on the Mount of Transfiguration that they build a tabernacle for Moses and one for Elijah and one for Jesus. God himself rebuked Peter for saying that. And one thing we know about Elijah, he didn't rise from the dead. Still others said that Jesus, well, he's like Jeremiah. Maybe he's Jeremiah, who was also a great prophet of God. He predicted the fall of Jerusalem to Babylon. He was called the weeping prophet, and he was a man of great compassion. Some Jews considered him to be the greatest prophet. He prophesied faithfully in a time when nobody wanted to listen to God's word. Can you imagine that? He was faithful until his death, and still he was nothing compared to Jesus. Tradition says that he was stoned to death, but he didn't rise from the dead either. And then there were others that they were just more general in their answer. They just said, well, he's one of the prophets, which seems like a very casual and kind of indifferent position to take, but it's a common position today. The world doesn't want to commit to something specific. Well, he's some sort of a prophet. People say, well, he was a prophet for sure, but really nothing more than that. And it's interesting to me how many people know they can't deny that he was a prophet, but they're just not prepared to say anything more than that. Let me just say this. The Muslims believe, their Quran says, that Jesus was a sinless prophet, unlike Muhammad, who needed forgiveness. That's right in their Quran. They believe that Jesus was born of a virgin. They believe that he ascended into heaven, that he lives forever. But if he were in fact a sinless prophet, and of course I believe he was, he has to be the Son of God because that's what he claimed to be. And if he claimed to be the Son of God and he's a sinless prophet, he couldn't have been a liar. So if he's not God in the flesh, he can't be a prophet at all. If he's not God in the flesh, he's a liar. One of the cornerstone beliefs in the religion of Islam is that Allah has no son. The Quran denies his death and therefore his resurrection. And yet the Quran has Jesus predicting both his death and his resurrection while still a baby. Now, I haven't figured out how they explain that exactly. I'm not going to read that to you from the Quran, but I think it's on your flash drive that you got. But it's certainly true that Jesus was a prophet. There's no question. That's certainly true. But to just simply say that Jesus is a prophet or one of the prophets falls way short of who Jesus really is. He's not just one of the prophets. He is the prophet. He's God in the flesh. So let me just summarize man's answer by saying the world still gives insufficient answers to the question of who Jesus is. The Jews believe he was a pretender. Others believe he was a good moral teacher of ethics like Confucius or Buddha. Some consider him to be a philosopher like Socrates or Plato or Aristotle. The Jehovah's Witnesses and the Mormons, they teach that he's one of God's sons. The New Agers and the Gnostics, they believe he was some kind of a mystical teacher and even a worker of miracles. And the Hindus believe he's one God out of many. There's a lot of people out there that think he's some kind of a prophet. But all these answers fall way short of who Jesus actually was and actually is, because none of them count him as God in the flesh and the Lord of all things. Which brings us to God's answer to the question. After the apostles had listed all the answers that men gave concerning who Jesus is, Jesus asked them who they said he is. Peter gives what Jesus calls the right answer, and he gives the answer that Jesus said came from the Father as opposed to coming from men. This is why I call it God's answer, not Peter's answer. Peter's the one speaking, but the answer actually came from God, not from men. When Jesus said that Peter was blessed for not getting his answer from flesh and blood, he was saying Peter didn't get his answer from what other people thought. He didn't take a poll, right? Have you been called lately to take a poll? I have. The poll that counts is the one at the voting booth. That's the one that counts. He didn't form his opinion based on some focus group or some meeting of the minds. He had witnessed the miracles of Jesus. He had heard his teaching. He had spent time with the man, Jesus. He saw the sinless life that Jesus lived, and he witnessed the prophecies of Messiah from the Old Testament that Johnny talked about earlier being fulfilled by Jesus. And so he ignored what the world said, and he answered based on the evidence that was in front of him. Peter said that Jesus was the Christ. That, of course, is the Greek word. The Hebrew word that's equivalent would be Messiah. Means the anointed one. He's the Christ. Now, of course, you know there were 3 offices in the Old Testament that were anointed. There was prophet, and there was priest, and there was king. By calling Jesus the Christ or the Messiah, the anointed one, Peter is saying that Jesus is all of these. In fact, by saying he is the Christ, He's saying that Jesus isn't just any anointed one. He is the anointed one. He's not just a prophet. He's the prophet. He's not just a priest. He's the priest. He's not just a king. He's the king. He's not saying that he's not just saying Jesus is the prophesied one that the Jews have been looking and waiting for, but he's even the author of those prophecies. Peter went on to say that he wasn't just the Christ, but that he's the Son of the living God. Not a son, the Son. And he's not the son of some dead god or some idol. He's the Son of the living God. He's saying that Jesus is God in the flesh. He is deity incarnate. Now, how do we know that's the right answer? Well, Jesus, of course, tells Peter that his answer is the correct one. But he goes on to say that this truth of who Jesus is the rock upon which he's going to build his church. It needs to be said here that Peter is not the rock on which the church was built. Peter's not the rock. And there's several reasons that ought to be clear. I'm just going to run through these very quickly. Each one deserves a little more time than I'm going to give it. But I'm just going to give you 5 quick reasons why Peter's not the rock. But the truth of who Jesus is the rock. First of all, the entire passage is not about Peter. It's about Jesus. Did you notice that? From verse 13 all the way through verse 20, the whole theme is the person of Jesus. Who is Jesus? That's the question, not who is Peter. Secondly, we're plainly told in Scripture that Jesus is the foundation upon which the church was built. 1 Corinthians, for example, in chapter 3. By contrast, Peter is merely a man, even by his own admission. You remember what he said when he goes to Cornelius' house and Cornelius begins to bow down to worship him. He said, stand up, because I myself am a man. Thirdly, it's Jesus' church, not Peter's. Peter has been given the keys to the kingdom, which makes him the gatekeeper, not the foundation. Fourthly, it's foolish to think that the church was built on nothing more and nothing more stable than impetuous Peter. One thing Peter was not, at this point at least, was a rock. Later on, Jesus said, you remember when he first met, he said, you'll be called Cephas, which means rock. And but there were a lot of times Peter wasn't very solid, but he became that. Fifthly, the Greek word for Peter here is Petros, which is male gender for a stone, which is equivalent to Cephas, which means stone. And it's the word translated stone, and John tells us that in John chapter 1. But by contrast, the Greek word for rock here is Petra, which is female gender, and it's a massive rock. It's the same word that's used for rock when Jesus tells of a man who built his house on a rock. That's not just a stone. That's a mass of rock. So Jesus is not saying that he's going to build his church on Peter. He's saying he would build his church on this rock. The rock is the truth about who Jesus is. The church is built on the very person of Jesus. To say that you can attack the person of Jesus, but it's not an attack on Christianity, is the height of stupidity. It's the height of folly. The fact that he is the Christ, the Son of the living God, that's what the church is built on. That's what Peter preached on the day of Pentecost, and it's what he preached elsewhere. It's what Paul preached everywhere he went. It's what all of Christianity is based on and built upon. Without that truth, there is no church of Christ. You notice that when Philip goes down to Samaria, what did he preach to him? Jesus. When Philip is talking to the eunuch, what did he preach to him? Jesus. And you go on. And what are they preaching? They're preaching Jesus. The truth of who Jesus is. Now, I've run into a lot of people. I've run into some that claim that Jesus never actually existed. And here's their logic. He never wrote a book. He never built any buildings or any monuments. Well, that's absurd on the face of it. However, it completely ignores that Jesus built something far more permanent than any physical building or monument. He built his church on the foundation of his own person. Who Jesus is the rock upon which the church was built. This is an eternal building. Hebrews tells us that it's an eternal building. It's Mount Zion. It's the city of the living God. It's the heavenly Jerusalem. It's the general assembly and church of the firstborn. Far more permanent than any monument or any building you could think of building, and far more permanent than any writing you could write outside of the divine scriptures, which of course are preserved by the power of God. Now I want you to notice that after Jesus said he would build his church on the rock of his person, he said that the gates of Hades would not prevail against it. Now there's different opinions about what exactly Jesus meant by this. I'm just going to run through this very quickly so I don't run short on time. Some point out to the gates of the city and they say, well, the gates of the city is where the rulers meant to make their plans, and that's certainly true. And so they say what Jesus meant was that the plans of Hades itself would not prevail against his church. Well, I think that's true, that the plans of Hades are not going to prevail against the church, but I don't think that's what Jesus meant here. Other people say, well, the gates of the city is where the weapons of the city were kept, and so what Jesus is saying, all the weapons of Hades are not going to prevail against the church. And I believe that's true too, but I don't think that's what Jesus meant here. Others go into great detail about what the Greeks believed about the gates of Hades and the three-headed dog and how nobody could ever, escape from Hades and so on. And I just say that's certainly true, but I don't know how much the apostles or even the average Jewish reader of Matthew knew about that. Certainly the Greeks believed it was impossible to escape from Hades. That's certainly true, but I don't think Jesus probably had Greek mythology in mind when he said this. Seems to me that the meaning here is really pretty simple. The word, of course, is not hell, Gehenna, it's Hades. Hades is the realm of the dead as opposed to hell proper, Gehenna, which is, of course, also called the lake of fire. And it seems to me that Jesus is just simply saying that death itself, not even the gates of Hades, the realm of the dead, can stop him from building his church. In fact, it was his victory over death that brought the church into existence. I want you to notice very carefully that it was from this time that Jesus began to tell his apostles about his death and resurrection. I stopped at verse 20, but I want you to see what it says in verse 21. From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed and be raised the third day. That's when Jesus began to tell them about his resurrection. The statement about the gates of Hades, I believe, is simply a reference to his resurrection and his victory over those very gates. It was not possible, Peter says on the day of Pentecost, that the pains of death should hold him. He busted through those gates like they weren't even there. And this fact is, I think, a critical point to what Peter has to say on the day of Pentecost. The proof that Peter gave the correct answer to the question, who is Jesus? God's answer is found in the resurrection. The preachers in the book of Acts, I think, make this clear. Paul makes it clear in several of his letters. The apostles were witnesses to Jesus throughout the world, and the resurrection was the proof of who he is. And that's demonstrated by their preaching. You can see that, you could read on the flash drive you got. I've got some of those scriptures listed. Now, I just want to say this. Historically, there have been two main errors concerning who Jesus is. I think you can categorize them into two sort of categories. The first is that he was not fully man. Somehow he was less than fully human. The Gnostics believe that error. He couldn't possibly have been fully human because if he had a physical body, that would be sinful, that would be wicked, that would be evil. So the Gnostics believe that. But the second is that somehow he's not fully God. And there's a lot of cults that believe this today. In one way or another, they say he's not fully God. But both of these are proven to be errors by the facts of the gospel. Now, what's the gospel in a nutshell? Well, it's the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. His death and burial, what does that prove? He was fully human. His resurrection, he had a human body that could die and it was buried. But the resurrection and the ascension, what does that prove? He's fully God. The gates of Hades couldn't hold him. He has the keys to death and Hades. He had authority even over man's greatest enemy, death. He's truly immortal. He's alive forevermore. Now let me just say this. The world understands the significance of the resurrection. That's why they attack it. That's why they attack the gospel. Islam, they don't try to deny the resurrection. They just try to deny the death. They say, well, he didn't really die, and therefore he didn't raise from the dead. All unbelievers in one form or another deny the resurrection of Jesus. They try to explain it away any number of ways, and I don't have time to take a look at those, but I've got some notes about that in my manuscript that you have on your flash drive. But let me just say one thing about that. The first lie, of course, about his resurrection was the one that they paid the soldiers to tell. Now, I just want you to stop and put yourself in those soldiers' position for a minute. You're there guarding the tomb of a dead man. And all of a sudden, the stone is rolled away, and out comes that dead man, and they were so terrified they fell down like dead men themselves. And then they go into town and they tell what happens, and they say, well, here, take some money and say that the disciples came and stole the body while he slept. And they took the money. How much money would it take for you, if you saw that yourself, to keep quiet about that? Most of us keep quiet about it for free. All kinds of things that people come up with and invent all kinds of theories to try and prove that Jesus didn't really raise from the dead. But the only reason they do that is because they know if he did raise from the dead, he's who he claims to be, and therefore they have to listen to his teaching. They know how significant the resurrection really is. And let me remind you where the church began and when the church began. Just a short time after the resurrection, in Jerusalem. There has never been a time and place in history where the people were in a better position to know the truth or falsity of the resurrection than there was on the day of Pentecost in the city of Jerusalem. And yet, what is the fact that Peter emphasizes the most in his sermon to prove that Jesus is both Lord and Christ? It's the fact that he rose from the dead. That is the rock upon which the church was built. Now you gather all the evidence of the resurrection and put it together, and that's a lot more than what we've talked about here. I just want to say, when you gather all that evidence together, if that doesn't convince you that Jesus is the Christ, I don't know what possibly could. When you're in a world of unbelievers, it matters what you confess about Jesus. The world is going to offer these cheap and easy explanations that really don't explain anything at all. The resurrection leaves us with proof of only one position about Jesus. He's the Christ, the Son of the living God. No lesser view of him will suffice. He is the way, he is the truth, and he is the life. And no man comes to the Father except through him. We have no reason to be ashamed of Jesus. He's Lord of all. Let's bow before the prophet and the priest and the king and serve him all our lives. He is the rock on which the wise man builds his house. He is the rock that can withstand any storm that this world or any other world can throw at us. He is the Christ, the Son of the living God. Build your life on that rock.